Hello and welcome to Unbelievable, the show which brings Christians and non-Christians together to discuss theology and philosophy. I'm John Nelson, and today on the show we're going to be diving into all things morality. What would it mean for morality to be objective? And if we grant the objectivity of morality, how can we best account for it? Joining me to untangle these questions are two writers who have thought a lot about this question from a Christian and secular perspective. Caleb Woodbridge is the host of the Imaginative Discipleship podcast and writes at Bigger on the Inside, and Thomas Walker-Worth is managing editor at The Objective Standard, a journal of culture and philosophy. I was hoping in the first part of this show that we could get to grips with this term objective, because objective and subjective are notoriously slippery terms in philosophy. And Thomas, you've grappled a lot with the idea of this notion of the objective standard, which is based in the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Can you begin by unpacking that idea for us? What is objectivity in the context of Rand's objectivism?
So I think the most fundamental idea in Rand's philosophy is that existence is an absolute. Existence exists independent of any particular observer's view of it. So existence is objective in the sense that it is the same regardless of what any of us thinks. There's one truth, there's one fact. There are not multiple different realities. We do not live in different worlds from each other. There's one objective reality. Philosophically, subjectivism is the idea that an individual, or the truth about the world, metaphysically or ethically, is a matter of an individual's perspective. An individual can, the idea that one thing's true for you, another thing's true for me. In some parts of the world, it may be ethical to do something, in other parts, it may not. And Rand's view is that not only is metaphysics objective, as in the actual nature of reality physically and the history of the universe and things like that, but also ethics in exactly the same way is equally objective. There is one correct, basic, fundamental set of moral principles that can be derived using reason. And it's not a question of, a particular person's context is a factor in that objective determination of what's right in a particular context, but there is not a different correct ethical code for one group of people or one person versus another.
And lots of people will have heard of Kant's categorical imperative or utilitarian ideas about ethics. How does Rand's view maybe differ slightly from those attempts to root ethics in reason?
So I think Kant had a very different conception of reason from Rand, and Kant, he wrote the Critique of what he called pure reason. He was, in a sense, against what had been treated as reason following Descartes, like in the history of philosophy up to that point. Rand's conception of reason is the fact that man or human beings have the faculty of looking at reality, using our senses to perceive facts about reality, and then integrating that in our minds. So for Rand, reason is the process of integrating facts into a coherent, non-contradictory body of knowledge and understanding of the world. So it's as simple as you look at three glasses here on the table and you can integrate together the concept of glass. You can do that with everything in the world, including more abstract concepts like justice and love and things like that. You can look at all the concrete examples of it and integrate them into a concept. And that, for Rand, is what reason is that process of identifying commonalities between things in reality, building concepts out of that. Rand very much followed Aristotle philosophically, and his idea of genus and differentia, of looking out at the world and identifying similarities and differences between different things, and then integrating all of that without contradiction, without any. Whenever you find a contradiction in your thinking, that's a sign that you've made a mistake or you're missing some information or something like that. Very different from the sort of post-Descartes conception of reason, this idea that Descartes really started of, you have some kind of starting premise. For Descartes, it was, I think, therefore I am. And you reason, you sort of logically derive forward from that starting premise, which can, if that starting premise is not anchored in evidence and reality, can lead you into all sorts of bizarre directions, as happened, I think, in Descartes kind of, I think, sort of knew where he was going to some extent before he started, but further down the line, that leads into you human people like that starting to deny the evidence of the senses altogether or causality altogether. So for Rand, it's always anchored in evidence. It's integrating evidence into a coherent worldview.
In Caleb, how would your Christian view differ on the objectivity of morality from this Randian perspective?
Yeah, so there's a lot of common ground in the idea that morality is objective, that it's something there that we can perceive and reason about, and that we are talking about something that is universal, not something subjective that varies from place to place and time to time. So I think to that extent, it's like, well, I think this is on the right lines. There's overlap here. I think where some of the differences emerge is partly in where that's grounded. And I'd say that from my perspective as a Christian, I'd see that as a signpost to a deeper reality. So it's like, yes, that's good as far as it goes, but to really, really ground that and give authority to that objective morality, you need to go a level deeper, and that there is a creator God whose own life and being of love, goodness, justice, mercy, and so on, his life is the standard of morality, not human life. So I think humans are made in the image of God, and so there is a connection there. There's a reflection there. So I think there's a sense in which objectivism is heading in the right direction. I just say it needs to go deeper, and because it doesn't have those deeper roots, I'd also then see it as being truncated in certain ways, that particularly when it comes to the idea of sacrifice, of love, of self-giving love. The Christian ethic allows us to go deeper and show a greater concern for the poor, the vulnerable, those who perhaps aren't able to be productive and to give, but still have dignity and value objectively based on who they are as being made in the image of God.
Thomas, I wonder, Caleb there mentioned a sort of inherent value and dignity. Mm-hmm. Is there a kind of inherent value and dignity to man on the Randian perspective?
In essence, so there's a few things I need to sort of unpack here. So firstly, I agree with the intention of, as you put it, going deeper. There is a lot of secular philosophy and a lot of sort of mainstream atheism, if you like, that stops at the material level, doesn't recognize, I think, the existence of what you might call the soul or the spirit. The fact that human beings do have a part of ourselves that is conceptual, it's the part of us that can abstract. We know from evidence that exists. I think it's folly to deny the existence of consciousness, of free will, of all those things. So I very much reject the sort of Sam Harris view of just denying those things on a materialistic ground. I just don't think that discovering and understanding those deeper elements requires going beyond the world of perceptual evidence. I think we can do that from what's visible. We don't need to bring in the concept of a God, which I don't regard there as being evidence for. As regards the sort of inherent value, if you want to put it that way, of a human life, Rand doesn't see, and Objectivism doesn't see things as necessarily having inherent value, because for Rand, she always said any question of value presupposes the question for whom and to what. Like, things are valued by a valuer. I can see in sort of the Christian view, God is potentially the valuer in that context. But for Rand, it's not just humans, actually, but all life is capable of holding values to some extent. Even a plant acts to gain and keep sunlight. And a value for Rand was that which a life form acts to gain or keep. Plants obviously cannot hold abstract values, neither can most animals, or counting ourselves as animals. Like, as far as we know, most animals don't have that faculty, but you can see a hierarchy in sort of complexity of values that different life forms can hold. If you go from a plant to an insect to a higher animal, dogs, cats, they value other life forms. They value obviously food and drink and things like that, but companionship as well. There's this higher level of value going on there. Humans, uniquely as far as we know, have this ability to value conceptually. So we don't just stop at a warm cuddle and seeing somebody we like and things like that. We can conceptualize concepts such as love. I mentioned justice before, curiosity, reason, all these things. We have this conceptual faculty that we've developed. Maybe that we're not the only life forms in the universe that have that faculty. There may be others on Earth or elsewhere. But as far as we know currently, we are the only ones. And that is the source of value. It's the conceptual faculty. So in a sense, any being with that conceptual faculty has the capacity to value things, and by possessing that faculty deserve certain rights, certain respect, notwithstanding actions that person then takes that may lose some of that right. But yes, there is a basic level of dignity we should treat other people with that we can see from their nature. You see a person who has that faculty, you should treat that person appropriately. You shouldn't molest or you bother that person. Certain things you shouldn't do. That doesn't, in the objectivist view, create an obligation on you to do things for that person. Now, it may well be that in your personal value hierarchy you still want to. Charity is a perfectly reasonable thing to do in all sorts of cases. But I think both philosophically and pragmatically, if you look at it, pursuing your rational self-interest, not just your desires, but your rational self-interest, carefully thinking about your values and pursuing them, will ultimately lead to better results for you and for others than trying to pursue a philosophy that says I should disregard my rational self-interest and just prioritize helping others. And often pursuing rational self-interest, which very few people do consistently in the world today, but and I'm not saying that I'm an exemplar of that necessarily, but like in general, we sort of think of self-interest as abusive business practices and climbing over other people to get what you want. And that's very much not what rational self-interest is. Rational self-interest is thinking deeply about the principles that you want to live by, which for an objectivist is reason, purpose, self-esteem, and then all the sort of objectivist virtues of justice, integrity, honesty, and all of those, and implementing those in your daily life. And I think a world where everyone, or at least a large portion of people, did that, where we had a culture that emphasized those values, would see a lot less poverty, a lot less suffering, would have a much richer society, a much more creative, much more productive society that would, yes, a lot of people would be a hell of a lot wealthier. There would be maybe more inequality. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. The thing is that it would be a just society and a wealthy society. And at the moment, a lot of people suffer, and this makes me really angry. I see people on the streets and things like that, and they're suffering because of lousy government education, regulations that are strangling business, all those sorts of things, which are all, in my view, violations of people's rights that are resulting in those outcomes. I think there will always be some people who end up in situations like that through choices of their own or choices of others. But in a wealthy society where people have more disposable income, people are freer, people are happier, I think there'll be a lot more charity, a lot more willingness of people to extend that helping hand once they're already living happy, meaningful lives themselves.
Caleb, what do you make of that in terms of, just having this rational capacity and having this these set of values? Is that enough to deserve certain rights? And does that provide some level of grounding, do you think?
Yeah. So I think what I'd point to would be, I think there's reason can get us so far, and reason is definitely a good thing. And I think one of the areas where Ayn Rand critiqued Christianity was seeing it as mysticism, seeing it as irrational, whereas I would very much see there as being good, rational reasons for believing in Christianity. Faith in the sort of traditional Christian understanding isn't belief in the absence or evidence or against evidence. It's reasonable belief plus personal commitment. So it's more than just an intellectual knowing, but it's not less than believing things you've got good reason to be true, or you should have ideally. Not necessarily every Christian will have thought things through rationally, just as with many different worldviews, but in principle, Christianity invites us to believe on the basis of evidence, on the basis of witness. And also then the limit of reason comes in that we are desiring creatures. We are driven as much by story, by desire, by things that are extra rational, not necessarily irrational. And you have to figure that into your process of how you come to these conclusions. I think if you assume that you can arrive at answers purely by objective reason, you've probably got some hidden motives, hidden biases that you need to account for. So saying that there's more going on in terms of our moral reasoning than just rational reasoning isn't to say that we should be irrational. It's just recognizing the complexity of who we are as human beings. And from a Christian perspective, because we have sinned and rebelled against God, that damages our ability to know truly. We've got all sorts of inbuilt motives for wanting to evade the truth and wanting to suppress the truth. And so part of what we need, one of the reasons we need God to step in and speak and to reveal truth to us, is to speak to that and to correct the ways in which we are avoiding reality and avoiding reason because we've got a vested interest in going our own way and behaving in selfish ways. So I think it's a lot more complicated than the sort of objectivist account of knowing would allow for.
I wonder, what do you make of that idea that there are maybe presuppositions, or there is a kind of emotional will towards certain ethical philosophies and ideas? Yeah. I mean, obviously, Rand would talk a lot about rational self-interest, and we tend to think of rationality as a sort of, disembodied, talking head or talking brain in a similar way to Descartes. Is that how you are perceiving rationality? And how are our whole sort of embodied selves coming into this picture of rationality and choosing this particular ethical philosophy?
Yeah, so I want to put a pin in original sin because I need to come back to that. But it's a lot of what Caleb just said, I would actually class as being part of reason. Like you said, recognizing the fact that we are emotional creatures. Like reason, as I said in the objectivist view, is looking at reality in its totality. As best we can with our, admittedly, you can call our means of perception flawed in a sense, only if you posit the existence of some kind of perfect perception, which doesn't exist as far as we can determine. So I don't think it's right to consider human perception flawed. Human perception is accurate according to the means of perception we have. So we can see correctly with our eyes. We can see things as they appear when looked through human eyes correctly. I see this blue wall because blue light is reflected into my eyes. I can't see the infrared. That doesn't mean I'm seeing falsely. It just means I'm seeing accurately with the means of perception I have. And I think the same is true of our reasoning mind. We have this faculty of integrating. It doesn't necessarily, it works, but it's not going to work if pieces of evidence are missing and things like that, or if it's being distorted by emotions and other things. So we need to look at ourselves the same way we look at the outside world. We need to recognize our nature as beings which have evolved to have both of these faculties. That we do have an amygdala, we do have that animal side of ourselves, those passions, those drives. They get in the way of our reason. Even the most disciplined philosophers and people who live by objectivist or other sort of reason-based creeds as very thoroughly and very rigorously are still going to be susceptible to that to some extent. I am aware of that. I have emotions that drive me away from my rational values and have caused me problems in the past because of that. And I need to acknowledge that, and I need to introspect about that. And I think we will succeed in life as individuals and as a society to the extent that we do that successfully, that we have our reason ultimately in control of that complete faculty. Emotions are important. They play an important role. We should not, objectivism is not Vulcan philosophy or Stoicism. It's not this rejection of emotion. Emotion is the thing that gives our lives meaning. When we act to achieve our rational values, because they're rational values, because we know they're good for us, the emotions that we experience as a result are a payoff for that, the positive emotions. And it's a very different payoff when you achieve a rational value to when you achieve an irrational one. If you achieve, so to speak, something that you know on some level isn't good for you, like you rob a bank and you come away with a bunch of money, you might feel like, yay, I succeeded, I have money now. There's a bit of you that's going to be like, I've done a bad thing. It's always going to be in my head that I've done that. Also, I'm at risk of being caught, and all that's going to be there as well. If you create a life-serving innovation, you write a good book or something like that, or you progress some technology, whatever it is, save a life, anything like that, you come away with this much fuller sense of happiness. What Aristotle called eudaimonia, that sense of having achieved life-serving values and being a consistently good human being and being the best version of yourself. And that's a kind of happiness that you can't get from pursuing an irrational value.
Caleb, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So I would like to affirm that I think that in a limited sense that the pursuit of rational self-interest is good and not in opposition to Christian values, because I think Christianity assumes that you're invited to believe because it will contribute to your flourishing, that God is our highest good, and so our fullest flourishing is found in knowing him and in relationship to him. So from the point of view of rational self-interest, there's nothing better than you can do than to pursue him. Obviously, the question then is one of fact, is that is he really there? And if not, then obviously that's a delusion, not in correspondence with reality. So I think there is a big question here that turns just on those objective questions. But in principle, it's a rational thing to believe on the evidence of Scripture, on the evidence of various philosophical arguments that give us clues pointing to the need for a first cause and all of these different types of arguments to arrive at a rational conclusion that God is there. And then for it to be in one's rational self-interest to follow that God, to worship that God, and to know that God. So that's the sort of invitation that Christianity makes. But it also says that we have to die to self to achieve our fullest flourishing. Jesus says, whoever wants to follow me must take up their cross. And often a short-term focus on rational self-interest, as I'm sure you will recognise, a too short-term view can sabotage your long-term rational self-interest. And I think if you're just looking at it in terms of this life and what we can achieve, then you are missing out on the greater fulfilment and greater flourishing that is on offer. And so it's there's John Piper is a theologian. There's pros and cons to his take on things, but he talks about Christian hedonism, and he doesn't mean a sort of willful just going out and whatever gives you most pleasure is fun, but the idea that pursuing joy in God is a rational, satisfying thing to do, that it's not opposed to that. Jesus, for the joy set before him, went to the cross. He sacrificed himself because there was a greater good to be achieved by it. And the sacrifices we're called to as Christians aren't a self-negation that obliterates the self, but ones where we go, because God is self-giving love, we can be self-giving too, because we receive life from him, and we know that we will receive back life from him greater than anything that we lose in following him.
Well, there's a lot there. I do want to give you an opportunity to respond, Thomas, but we do need to go to a quick break. So if you're enjoying the show, do give us a follow at UnbelievableFE on X and at Premier Unbelievable on YouTube and Instagram. We'll be back in just a moment.
I look at it less as a debunking argument, not trying to undermine classical monotheism, but rather just as a really helpful framework to understand why those like Swinburne, for example, who say that belief in God is cumulative and it's a combination of all these, I call them in one of my papers belief bricks, and they're constructing this wall about why we believe in God. If we can analyze each of these belief bricks through the lens of the evil God challenge, then we can figure out, which belief bricks does my wall of belief actually really fundamentally rest on?
It's not just there's an absence of reason to trust in our cognitive faculties, but if we were to accept the evil God hypothesis, we would have positive reason to distrust our cognitive faculties, because the evil God, by hypothesis, would want to deceive us in all sorts of ways. And the good God hypothesis doesn't have that upshot. In fact, it's the opposite.
Welcome back to Unbelievable, where I'm discussing the objectivity of morality with Thomas Walker-Worth and Caleb Woodbridge. Thomas, I wonder what you make of that idea that actually maybe the most rationally self-interested thing we could do is all to become Christians and find our sort of fullest joy in God.
Well, so I would obviously say no. And I think I think Caleb's kind of touched on two of my biggest moral problems with Christianity, and so this is one of them, which is the idea of delaying or offsetting happiness in this life for the sake of another life. And because I don't believe there's any evidence that we have another life or that there is anything beyond death, I think it's a great tragedy, in fact, that untold millions or billions of people in multiple religions, not just in Christianity, have foregone happiness in this life for the sake of something that, in my view, never comes. And I think that's actually a crying shame. And so that's one of my probably two biggest issues with Christianity, the other being the concept of original sin, the idea that humans should look upon themselves as a sort of maybe damned or in some sense corrupted life form. I have exactly the opposite view. I love the Greek view of humanity, the classical view of humanity, that says humans are heroic beings. We are beings of great potential, beings of beauty, and we should see our own flourishing as a wonderful thing, and look for the best in humankind, and try to, that image of David, of Atlas, that kind of image of humanity is I think the upstanding human being, and the belief that almost all of us, notwithstanding severe illness or injury, almost all of us have the ability and the potential to achieve greatness in some form or other. Now, I mentioned earlier how important it is to look at our own nature when we're being rational about our goals and our values, and that includes our nature as humans and our nature as the individual humans that we are. And we all have different aptitudes, different skills, different natures. And so greatness for one person is going to be very different to another. It doesn't mean we all need to be high-flying entrepreneurs or inventors, or some of us can just be bus drivers and still have amazing, fulfilling, rational, meaningful lives. It's going to be different for everybody. And I say this with one of my best friends is a bus driver and absolutely loves it. And so that image of humanity as heroic is really important to me, and I think it's sad that the dominant philosophy in Western history has been, in my view, at odds with there's essentially two sides of Western culture. There's the Greek side and the Christian side, which goes back to the division in ancient Greece between Aristotle and Plato, because Christianity, I think, largely evolved in significant amount from Plato's philosophy. And so you had this, on the one hand, this Aristotelian classical view, scientific view of happiness as the proper goal of man, which is what many of the ancient Greek philosophers thought was the case. It was a kind of unassumed premise in ancient Greece that happiness is the goal of life. And that comes back into Europe from the Islamic world through Thomas Aquinas and people like that, and gets integrated with, or not really integrated, but sort of mixed with Christianity. But you still have this Platonic element as well, that's saying there's another world, and this is just a world of illusions, or some variation of that. I know there's a lot of different streams of Christian thought, but the Aquinas version tries to do this Aristotelian view of saying you're looking at reason, looking at the world is your means to know God, and then there's others that separate them more. But those two conflicting elements have been in our culture jointly pretty much since the time of Aquinas. And because we went to this very, very Platonic culture from Augustine through the Dark Ages, but since the time of Aquinas, we've had this kind of tearing culture, which has been, to a large extent, scientific and rational in the realm of metaphysics. We've made these amazing discoveries and technologies. We've never gone there in ethics. We've retained this sacrificial ethics, and I think that's created this culture we have today, where technologically we're this wonderful, advanced, futuristic culture, and yet so socially we're falling apart. And I want to see us catch up on the ethical side.
So I think there is a tension and a paradox within the Christian tradition, but I think that's true to human nature. I think we have both that tremendous heroic potential, but there's also something that is deeply flawed, that there is a potential both for great good and for great evil, and any account of human nature has to do justice to both those sides. And I think that from a Christian perspective, I'd see us being made in the image of God, us having that tremendous potential, but it is distorted. We're glorious ruins, as Francis Schaeffer described it. We are we've got both glory enough to lift the head of the lowliest beggar, as C.S. Lewis said, and it's shame enough, being a human, being a son of Adam or daughter of Eve, to bow the head of the noblest king. And that seems to me to be real and to reflect the paradox of human nature, that we can be both. But what Christianity promises is a restoration of that heroic side. And I think that unless you diagnose the sickness, you can't properly catch up, you can't properly be restored to the fullness of what humans are being without recognizing what's gone wrong and getting to the root of that.
Can I just address something on that? So I think, just looking at it philosophically, to treat something as flawed, I think you first have to have a conception of what a not flawed version of it would look like, what the correct version of a human being is. And I think to look at human nature and say this isn't the way it should be is a philosophical error. It's the same philosophical error that people make when they look at the world generally and say that, look, we shouldn't have a world with hurricanes in it or something like that, which is actually an argument that's used against Christianity sometimes, is this problem of evil. Why are there hurricanes? Why are there earthquakes? There just are. That's just part of the nature of existence. And that's how Objectivism looks at everything outside of human action, basically, or outside of the action of conceptual beings, is that things simply are the way they are. Matter is matter. The world is A is the way. And again, this comes from Aristotle. Things simply are the way they are. And human nature, as we are as a species, having developed the way we have, is simply a fact of reality. There isn't a better way we're supposed to be by historical nature. We simply are what we are. And we need to be the best version of what we are that we can be. And that was the Aristotelian view. It is, be the best man you can. Don't try to be not a man, which I think is more the direction that what you're saying is going. You may not see it that way, but I think that's what it is. Is it saying that let's try to turn man into an angel or into God, into this, in my view, invented concept that doesn't have a referent in reality. Whereas the Objectivist view is, be the best human being that you can. Recognize that human beings have this rational faculty. We have an emotional side as well. We have the ability to integrate the two and to use that evolutionary advantage of the rational faculty to grow, to thrive, to flourish, and achieve a fantastic future.
I think one question I have on this is, you say be the best man you can be, or we should pursue these things. I mean, obviously there is a nature of man, whatever that is. But I suppose one big question for the sort of Randian philosophy is whether I ought to pursue my rational self-interest. Is there a sense in which there is a moral obligation? Because we often think about morality in terms of obligations. But am I obliged, once I've realised that I am a rational being, to actually follow any particular course? Or could I sort of choose to sort of embrace the absurdity of my existence?
Essentially, yes. You're obliged by the nature of reality. So Objectivism is not a creed that you have to follow. Like that, there are not the Objectivist virtues are not orders of faith, articles of faith. So it's not a categorical imperative, like you referenced earlier. It's not a set of things you must do because somebody says so. It's a set of things that you need to do if you want the right outcomes, if you want to flourish as a human being.
It's a hypothetical imperative?
Not even that. It's in the sense, yes, it's hypothetical in the sense that if you want to flourish, if you want to suffer and die, sure, don't. But it's based on the assumption that you want to flourish, that everybody wants happiness and prosperity, which I think the vast majority of people do without severe mental illness or other factors getting in the way of that. Rand, in looking for an objective source of morality, Rand settled on the fundamental fact that life forms have a choice between living and not living, and that's the source of objective morality. Now, that doesn't just mean being alive. Life in the objectivist concept is not just the state of having a heartbeat and but physiological functions. Life is living as the entity that you are, functioning as the entity that you are. I often say that a lion is not living as a lion in a cage, and in the same sense, a human being is not living as a human being if he's not or she's not exercising his rational faculty and achieving meaning and purpose in life. So I think this was a philosophical error that manifested during COVID, when we implemented these widespread lockdowns that basically stopped human life for 2 years for the sake of saving lives, which really meant prolonging suffering for people who are already at the ends of their lives and in great suffering. Now, there are a lot of practical steps that should have been taken to protect those people in different ways that weren't, but the philosophical failure there was to recognize that we were in fact destroying life because we were prioritizing keeping somebody's heartbeat going over letting people live their lives and live as human beings, and destroyed countless young people's early life and all sorts of other things, business, money, loads of prosperity, and human life was destroyed. And there was a lot of suicide and things like that because of that fundamental error, I think. So it's really important to recognize that life means living, and so just as you can tell the difference between a flourishing flower and a struggling one, the implicit goal of human life is to be the human equivalent of the flourishing bush with all the flowers out. Is you want to be the rational being that you are, the specific individual that you are, fully and successfully, and that's the proper goal of life.
Is that account something you resonate with?
Yeah, so I think that sense of flourishing is deeply important. One of the early church fathers said that the glory of God is a human being fully alive, and so I think that all of that. Yes, I would resonate with that description of the importance of human flourishing. I think just coming back to that question of what do we know? What's the standard of what a human being should be like if we're falling short of that? Where I'd point to that is to the person of Jesus as the perfect human being, and I think it was Athanasius on the Incarnation used the idea of, if you have a portrait that gets spoiled, then you get in the original subject so that you can redo it and correct it. And if we're made in the image of God, then we get God in to sit his portrait again. And so by God becoming a human being, that's him showing us in his life, in his sacrificial death, in his resurrection, that shows that it's not the giving up of something for a lesser value, but to achieve something of a greater value. That for me, and the historical basis for that would be, for me, grounds in objective fact, in objective history, that we do have a hope that is beyond death, that is resurrection, that is restoring the human image to something more fully alive. So obviously then you're getting into questions of historicity, reliability of the New Testament accounts and so on. But when it comes to the specifically Christian grounding for that, that's where I'd go with that.
You're reminding me a lot of Blaise Pascal as well, who I think stands in that Augustinian tradition, talking about the duality of man. And he very much thinks that we are wretched precisely because we were glorious. So he kind of like flips this kind of pessimistic anthropology on its head and says, okay, maybe it's true that Christianity has often emphasized the wretchedness of man, but only because there is that sort of original blueprint. Obviously, another big idea that Pascal had was that it might be rational in some sense to wager on God. So I wanted to ask you, Thomas, to what extent could it, or to what extent do you have to have confidence that there is no God to hold to this kind of Randian perspective? Because obviously a lot of people have found that the evidence, more or less compelling. And there does seem to be this great promise, this great offer that Christianity has. And Pascal's perspective is that maybe what is rational to do is to bet on that future interest. So do you have to be sort of totally confident that God does not exist to take on this rational self-interest in Rand's thought?
So firstly, I never found Pascal's wager compelling, just because if you did that and God does exist, God knows you're doing that. So like, it's not going to work. But so that never sort of flew for me. But to answer your question, in Objectivism, God is regarded as what philosophically I would call an arbitrary assertion. Richard Dawkins often uses the analogy of the celestial teapot. Like, if I hypothesize the existence of something that you can't disprove, and I say it exists, what's to say it doesn't? And his point there is that the burden of proof is on the person asserting the claim, not on the person denying it. And in Objectivism, arbitrary assertions have no philosophic weight. They just don't exist. So like, if something is not presented with objective evidence supporting it that integrates with all of the remaining evidence we have, so it's not just you say, here's a thing and here's a book that says it exists. It has to integrate without contradiction with the totality. So it can't involve human beings walking on water, which isn't possible. Like it without some kind of very compelling explanation of how that's worked. Like there's and I do think that there's no such thing as the supernatural. Like anything beyond nature doesn't exist. Nature is that which exists. So if somebody does walk on water, there's a means, there's a mechanism for how that's happened. If there were entities that could do the things that Jesus is said to have done, if those entities do exist, which they might out there in the universe, there's a means for how that happened. So the existence of God in the objectivist view is a assertion that doesn't require consideration, because it's arbitrary, and so you can reject those assertions without needing to. You can effectively say, I know he doesn't exist because there's no evidence for him existing. Like a thing that has no evidence for existing doesn't need to be considered as potentially existing. So you only need to consider those things for which you have evidence. Now, there's all sorts of things for which we have evidence that might not exist. A good example of this is dark matter. Like I as a sort of amateur physics enthusiast, I don't think dark matter actually exists. I think that's going to come out at some point in the future. But there's evidence that suggests it might, or something is there causing those discrepancies in the masses of galaxies versus how massive they should be as far as we can determine. That's probably just an error in math. But at the moment, there's a theory that gives rise to the idea that dark matter may exist, or dark energy, or things like that. So that those concepts exist in the realm of things that there's potentially evidence for, but we haven't found out enough to confirm or not. God in the objectivist view, like any other arbitrary assertion, exists in the realm of an idea with no philosophic standing or basis in evidence and reason. And as such, I would say I am also, beyond that, I'm confident that God in the Christian conception doesn't exist because I consider his nature contrary to the nature of reality. An entity of complete knowledge I don't think that's it. I don't think that can integrate with reality as I know it and understand it. So in that sense, yes, I would say I'm confident that God doesn't exist, but God is such a wide and nebulous concept. There's other forms of God, like the deistic conception of God or various other deities that people believe in, that may hypothetically be possible in a metaphysical universe that I just don't have evidence for. So I'm not going to say that for all of the gods anyone's ever believed in, but for the all-seeing, all-knowing version of God, like that to me seems completely contradictory to the world I live in and see and perceive every day.
Yeah, Caleb, I suppose the only question I can ask you is God an arbitrary assertion?
Well, I would obviously think not. So I think it's interesting, that example of dark matter, and that's something that has may or may not be there, but it has some explanatory function. There's various clues that suggest there's something going on there. And I think in the same sort of way, I would say that at least from the point of view of things like objective morality, which we agree exists, but things like consciousness, why is there something rather than nothing? There's all sorts of things where you could just say these are brute facts, there's no further explanation needed. But that seems to me implausible, and that an inference to the best explanation for all of these things would be that there is some meaning giver, some value giver, some ultimate first cause. And so it's at the very least worth considering the God hypothesis to see whether there is any evidence for that, whether that then explains all of these different features of reality that seem at least somewhat mysterious without God. So just in terms of, is it arbitrary? I don't think so. I think it's at the very least a plausible philosophical hypothesis to give consideration to. And then if it is plausible, then one of the questions we can then ask is, well, is there any evidence? Is there any sign that God has revealed himself, has spoken? And then you look at the specifics of some of the different religions and the claims that they make. And for me, I find that there is something that happened with the origins of Christianity that caused the people there to go from being devout monotheistic Jews to believing that Jesus was the risen Son of God. Something strange happened there, and I think that does demand some kind of explanation. And they, from very early on, we're saying we're worshipping Jesus, we're believing in Jesus as the risen Saviour. Very early on, empty tomb, historical claim being made. So I think it's worth at least being open to looking at that evidence and considering it. And if you look at all that and you think it's unpersuasive, that's a reasonable conclusion to come to. But I think there is an evidence-based argument, an evidence-based case to look at and to consider that is philosophically plausible and, at least in principle, open to rational and objective inquiry. So I'm not saying you have to swallow all that. I'm just saying it might be worth you looking into that a bit more and coming to a more detailed look at what you think the evidence actually points to.
Can I go?
Before we go to another quick break, I'd love to hear your...
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I applaud the method, definitely, like the intention of considering a hypothesis and looking at the evidence. And I don't think that's what the vast majority of religious believers do, but I applaud the fact, those of you who do, I applaud that intention. And yeah, there's definitely stuff to look at there. There's definitely interesting ideas to consider and to evaluate. We shouldn't just dismiss Christianity. We should definitely interrogate its myths, its values, and I think it's vitally important that we do that to all prominent belief systems. What I don't think we should do is entertain a hypothesis that contradicts evidence, and I think the hypothesis, if you want to call it that, of a being essentially without identity, a being of unlimited nature. In a universe where everything has identity, where the law of identity is essential to understanding reality, that a table is a table, that it's this big and it ends where it ends, and I end where I end, and I have the nature I have. And then we posit a being that doesn't, that is effectively limitless in knowledge, in scope, in time, in all of these things. And that's so contradictory to everything else that we observe about reality. And so to me, that doesn't make any sense. And the last point I would make is that I really like the idea that we should be okay with not having the answers to things. And a lot of people, I think, have this attitude of, if you don't know how the universe began, I don't actually think the universe began at all. I think it's probably just eternal. I have funny views on time, which I can get into another time, but like I essentially think that the universe is static and has always existed. It's just an entity that exists. And it's okay to not have all the answers to that. It's okay to recognize that by fact of human nature is we can only perceive what we can perceive. We've only got as far as we have in our journey of knowledge and discovery. There's a whole universe out there that we know next to nothing about, comparatively to how much is out there, and that's exciting to me. Like, I want to go forward and discover the truth. I don't want to make up an answer and try and fit it to what I know now as a human on Earth in 2025, when human-made objects haven't even got past the edge of our solar system yet, and humans haven't gone further than the moon. Like, and there's so much of Earth we've not even explored. Like, there's so much we don't know about reality, and a few thousand years ago, it was kind of understandable to think that you were in a smaller world and to try and hypothesize explanations. Now we know that we're one planet among hundreds of trillions. And we're going to have the audacity to start concluding that we know how the universe came about. Like, no, I want to be in multiple galaxies before I even start thinking I might have the answer to that. So, I think it's okay to just be cool with the limits of human knowledge and be excited to grow them and not try to jump to a conclusion at this stage.
There's so much to chew on there. We do need to take another break. So if you're enjoying this show and would like to see others like it, go to premierunbelievable.com. We'll be back in just a moment.
I would ask Tom this, and this is a surprising question maybe, to nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations.
The ideal of lifelong matrimony, I think that's a very distinctive Christian concept. I think the category of what by the 19th century is coming to be categorized as homosexuality and heterosexuality, I think they have no precedence. I think the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, I think all these are entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century, I think is entirely exclusive to Christian civilization. I think the idea that human beings are created in the image of God, that is obviously something that Christians share with Jews. It gives a degree of dignity to human beings that no other cultural tradition that I'm aware of even remotely approximates.
Welcome back to Unbelievable, where I'm joined by Thomas Walker-Worth and Caleb Woodbridge. We've been discussing the objectivity of morality, and I was hoping in this final part of the discussion that we could bring it back to everyday life. I know, Thomas, you've written a book called Reason for Living, a rational approach to living your best life. In practical terms, how does this Randian philosophy help us to do that?
So the big transformative thing for me is that Objectivism introduced me to the idea that I don't need to live on somebody else's terms. I don't need to accept other people's assumptions about what I should do with my life, and I don't need to impress other people unless it's a rational value for me to do that. Like, there are times where impressing somebody else is a rational value. Like if you try and get a job from somebody and that, that's a rational value, or somebody whose opinion you admire for good reason, and you want that person being impressed with you as evidence that you're living by your own values well. But you don't need the idea that I don't need to just impress my peers, my family members, my school teachers, people like that, with uncritically. I can choose my own values by my own reason and pursue them with vigor and happiness. And that idea, and the idea that work is the means to achieve my values, not something I do for someone else, those two elements were really transformative for me. So it just, Objectivist philosophy just undid the mindset that I think school had left me with, where work is something that teachers impose on you and you don't know why it's a value to you, if it even is. Sometimes it's not even a value objectively, I think, but sometimes even when it is, you don't know why it is. And you get this sense that, okay, you're supposed to do these courses, and then you're supposed to go find a job, and that's just a thing that society expects you to do. And it is this duty mindset, which is, I reject the sort of duty premise. So I reject this idea that we have a duty to give something back to society. And instead, I see us as having an obligation to identify our values and live the best lives we can. And productive work is a key element of that. Productiveness is one of Rand's 7 virtues. And so I suddenly had this transformed outlook where I had the freedom to identify and pursue my values, constrained only by the nature of reality. And suddenly the motivation to work hard in the achievement of them, because work wasn't for someone else anymore, it was for me. Now, it can be for someone else at the same time, but it was fundamentally to achieve my values.
And I'm interested, so when did that come about in your own journey, sort of discovering the work of Rand? And I mean, were you raised in a religious household and then sort of cast that off, or?
No, there were religious people in my family, but they weren't my sort of primary caregivers, if you like. My father, who I think I owe a lot to intellectually, he very much raised me to think critically. He didn't give me any particular philosophical or religious perspectives. I actually still, I mean, he passed away when I was 17, but I still don't really know what a lot of his philosophical views were. I've actually debated this with my mum. Like, the two people who knew him best, probably, we can't agree on what his ideas were. So he was quite good at not indoctrinating me with anything he thought, as far as I can tell. But he was very keen on the idea that I should think outside the box, that I should critically evaluate things with my own mind. And he said I should just look at religions, look at belief systems, see what I think. Same with politics and everything. Like, look, here's the major parties, here's the major religions, just see what they say. And I did a bit of that in all those fields, and I played with Christianity for about 2 weeks when I was a child, and I've investigated it a lot more. But like, in terms of taking it seriously as something I might believe, I had a period where I sort of quite devoutly tried to follow it for a short time, and debated all these things with all the people I met at school who were Christians and Muslims and other belief systems, and explored around. And I found that what appealed to me most was what I now understand to be a rational worldview. I found that the things that resonated with me were exploration, discovery, learning about the real world. I resonated with astronomy, with paleontology, with those sorts of sciences, and discovering. I want the answers to where we come from, but like I said before, I'm okay with the fact I don't know all of it yet. And so I built up this whole cluster of beliefs about human life, about reality. I followed the new atheists for a while, then I kind of found them a bit too militant and a bit lacking in sort of ethical premises, I think. Played with different political ideologies, but sort of again found that they were lacking in fundamentals. And when I discovered Rand, which is about 12 years ago now, what happened was that in one interview that I watched, her 1957 interview with Mike Wallace, she identified several things that I had already identified in different areas of life. The primacy of reason as our means of knowledge on the sort of fundamental philosophical level, but then also various things about how the state shouldn't control our education. That was something I'd already come to as a conclusion. More concrete things like that. And the fact that sort of happiness in some form is the ultimate goal of life. Like, that was already a conclusion I'd come to as well. I remember having debates when I was younger with my mum about saying, she was like, "Oh, we've got to go to work." And I was like, "But what's the point of going to work? It's so you can have fun at the end of the day, isn't it?" And that was a very sort of childish view of it. But ultimately, the point is so we can live great lives. It's not an end in itself. And so Rand tied all these things together and showed me the sort of underlying philosophical integration between them, and then also unhooked a few of the sort of ideas I picked up through osmosis from school. I think of that implicit duty premise that work is for other people and things like that, and also helped me understand, and this has been a longer process, helped me understand that I needed to develop stronger self-esteem, that I needed to have confidence in my own mind and belief in my own moral rightness, and that belief needed to be based on evidence, and so that I needed to act virtuously in life and then you derive self-confidence, self-esteem from that virtuous behavior and reinvest that into my growth. And that's still a journey I'm on today. Like, I don't have great, perfect self-esteem today, but it's 1,000 times better than it was 12 years ago. And that's empowered me to achieve things that I just wouldn't have had the confidence to even attempt before.
In terms of sort of how this plays out in everyday life, are there some sort of examples or maybe case studies of where you don't think this objectivist approach is really living up to the nature of reality?
Yeah, I'd be really interested to hear, Thomas, how when someone perhaps through no fault of their own isn't able to be productive, when there are humans who are more dependent, where there is that need for others to care for them very practically, sort of particularly maybe at the beginning of life, a sort of ill child or someone, a terminally ill spouse. Is there a moral obligation? I recognise that you would say that someone might choose to do this, but is someone doing something wrong if they walk away from someone in need? If they've got a sick child or if their spouse becomes terminally ill and there's no way of them any longer repaying, as it were, what the person is giving in all of the care and time and energy and cost involved in that. How would you approach those sort of situations?
So I would say that the obligation is to your values, your rational values. It's really important to your value. You can have irrational values as well, like if you're a gambling addict, gambling's a value for you, but that's not a rational value. Your obligation is to your worked out hierarchy of rational values. And you have to make a hierarchy decision in these sorts of situations. But your values are not just external, they're also your own self-esteem, your own sense of self-respect, your own happiness. To take a really simple example, if you see somebody's been attacked or been hit by a car or something, and they're lying in the street in need of help, and you look at that and then you think, no, I need to catch the train, and you walk off. I think any healthy person is going to be racked with guilt forever. Like it's just going to destroy you. You by leaving that person there, you've taken a self-destructive action. I think a similar thing's true probably if you have a family member or a child who's in a severe illness situation, and you rationally value that person, then or did when that person was in better health, perhaps. Again, you're going to destroy yourself, I think, by abandoning someone you loved, someone who has earned a commitment from you and an obligation from you. And there certainly are, there's sort of two kinds of obligations, I think, in Objectivism. There's obligations that are just facts of reality, like we just need to recognize certain principles are necessary for human happiness. And then there's the obligations we take on through choice. If you choose to conceive a child, you take on an obligation to see that child through his or her period of vulnerability, during which protecting that child's rights is your responsibility. Unless you trade with others to relieve yourself of that responsibility, you pass that child to somebody else who you trust with that, but that's still carrying out that responsibility in a section. If you just abandon the child, regardless of his or her health or anything like that, you are failing at an obligation that you voluntarily took on, and that includes if you didn't take precautions and things like that. That's still a voluntary taking on of that responsibility. So it's different depending on whether you know the person in need or not. It's different depending on what your past relationship is with that person. But in the context we live in at the moment, in the kind of society and economy we live in at the moment, we all have value hierarchies wherein we have much more pressing things in our personal lives than going and donating to a mental health charity or something like that, because we've a quarter to a fifth of our earnings every year is shoveled off to the government for them to waste on God knows what, and pardon the expression, and so much of what we could potentially be doing is constrained by regulations and by poor education and all of those sorts of things, and we find ourselves in this restrained culture where our ability to pursue our values is greatly limited, and we're living day to day just trying to make ends meet, and we all know that kind of context that most of us are in. When you're not in that context anymore, and you have clarity about your values, if you're in a free society, or you're wealthy and successful, and you're clear on and you think, okay, human flourishing is something I value. I am a human being. I want humans to flourish. I want to live in a flourishing society where every other person is achieving their potential, because every other person is a potential value to me. Unless he's a deranged psychopath or something, like almost everyone is a potential value to me. There's somebody who might produce values that's going to enrich the society I live in, add all sorts of values, practically or spiritually as well. So I want people to be better, healthier. So it makes sense for me to donate to cancer research, to donate to whatever, all of these sorts of causes. Not because I necessarily care about the individual recipient of my goodwill, but because I care about human life and I care about living in a flourishing, free society. So, and that's hierarchized with all my other values that I might want to donate to heritage and history and other values as well, like that.
Can I just press you? I think it's really laudable that you do value those human life in that more general sense, and I think most people would instinctively. But in a sense, I feel like you're being better than your philosophy consistently requires you to be. Is there any grounds on which to say that someone who could live with themselves, who for them it wasn't in their hierarchy of values to care that deeply, and who could do the sort of cost benefit analysis and go, actually, my wife of 40 years who needs daily care now. That's too big a cost. I'm walking away. Can you say on your grounds that they're actually wrong to do so?
I'm not in that person's head, so I don't know that person's hierarchy. So I'm very reticent to psychologize about any particular person. But I would strongly suspect that person is either not an objectivist or is severely screwing up their value calculation, that they're making some kind of error. I do believe people have the right morally to make errors and to make bad decisions. The only thing they don't have the right to do, in my view, is violate other people's rights to life, liberty, and property, which is various versions of the right to life, like the other people's right to do with their own lives as they will. If this guy's not doing that, if he's not violating somebody else's rights and freedoms, then if he wants to, be a unpleasant human being to his loved ones, that's his problem. And unfortunately, it seems like the wife in this story made a very poor choice of husband. But and hopefully she has other people who care about her. Now, if you go through life being remotely pleasant to people, there should be a fair few people around you who care about you. So, hopefully your significant other, spouse, isn't the only person. Hopefully you've got parents, friends, people like that who would step in those situations. And I think the rest of us in society would criticize this person. Like, if this person's a friend of mine, I'm probably not going to want to be friends with him anymore. I'm probably going to tell him that, I think he's made a bad decision. So I think that's the society I would like to move towards, is where people who do things that are not violations of others' rights and therefore shouldn't be legally obliged on them to do, notwithstanding that if they're in a contract or something, like, and we get into so many other things here. Like, I think in a free society, marriage would be a private contract, and you could go to different marriage providers and do different plans and things like that. And maybe this one says, if I fall ill, then you're financially liable for me, and then you have to fulfill that contract. But I don't like the fact that marriage is controlled by the state at the moment. But if you've not put any arrangements in place, and this guy's selfish in the popular sense of the word, not in the objectivist sense, where he's just going to be like, no, I want to go and play cards down the pub, and I don't care about my wife anymore, then we should all criticize and ostracize that person, and hopefully the victim of that has other people to fall back on. The one edge case that I think is worth discussing, by the way, there's all these levels of dependency and disability. If you reach a point where you don't have a rational faculty anymore, that's a very different conversation from if you're physically impaired or mentally impaired prior to that point. So most people who, and my uncle was in a mental rehab center for 13 years, like I've had experience of that. Most of the people in those sorts of places, they still have some rational faculty. They're still human. They're damaged humans, but they still have value, I think, as human beings. There are some people who have just completely lost that, who are no longer functioning human beings, people whose minds have been destroyed by trauma or whatever. And at that point, the question does come up: what are we protecting here? Like, if we are just protecting effectively a living organism that's nothing more than a plant in any meaningful sense, what are we investing resources in? Is this even affording dignity to the person it used to be? Or if it was never a person at all, like, is there any prospect of restoring this person to a functioning individual? I think that sometimes religion can get in the way of making a rational and ethical decision in those situations. Not necessarily your version of religion, I don't know, but some certainly, where you get people coming in and saying, yes, we should keep this completely destroyed life alive. And it's like, what's that achieving? At the end of the day, it's I think the person, if you could talk to the person, would rather be dead at that point anyway. And you're just sustaining something that's absorbing resources without ever producing a value for itself or for anyone else. So it can sound cold, but I think in a rational worldview, we do recognize that sometimes the thing that gives rise to human life having value can be lost, even if the human is still alive biologically.
Yeah, that's where I get quite uncomfortable, because I think in many ways I feel like moral sentiments, our moral values are still quite influenced by Christianity, even though Christian belief has declined. And so actually when you talk about it in a lot of cases, it will work out in quite a similar way. We'll want to do good for the wider society and for the people around us who we care for. But my worry would be that, particularly as the memory of Christian ethics and that idea of caring for all human life as having value fades into the background, that could potentially get darker and darker in terms of getting narrower and narrower in terms of who we extend that valuing of human life to. How would you, what's the safeguard in an objectivist philosophy against that getting too narrow?
Well, firstly, I'll just echo your concern, because I am very concerned at the direction of society at the moment. And there is truth to the fact that the vacuum that Christianity is leaving as it sort of recedes from prominence and has been doing for hundreds of years is not being filled. It's either not being filled or it's being filled by things that are arguably sometimes worse. And not necessarily just other religions that are rising in prominence, but also a kind of subjectivist or nihilistic, to sort of jargon bust, either this hedonistic philosophy of just whatever I want is true, or the nihilistic philosophy that just says there's no meaning, there's no purpose. And I think that would be a very horrifying future to move into. I think what we need urgently, and I think what objectivism is one of, if not the only philosophy to provide, is a rational, evidence-based, objective morality that very clearly defines what, like I've talked about the whole episode, very clearly defines what is moral, what is not, does not leave it open to one's whims. And that's a crucial cornerstone of objectivism, that you should never make a decision on a whim. Even about relatively minor seeming things, you don't need to do a philosophical exercise every time you go down to the shop, but you do want, especially if you're making a decision like that about, am I going to keep my mentally disabled wife on life support or something like that, then you've got to make those sorts of decisions in a very full context of values and know what you're dealing with. But I think that's why it's so important that those values are based on the nature of human life, is because otherwise we could end up making decisions like basically keeping a person in their vegetative state breathing for 20 years when they can't live a life, and that to me is tragic and heartbreaking, and I wouldn't want somebody to be in that situation. So
gentlemen, we're almost at the end of our discussion. It's been so fascinating, but before we go, I'd like to ask each of you, as we sort of think about what the future could look like, if we were to follow your version of objective morality and give us a 1-minute pitch, what could the future look like? Maybe we'll start with you, Caleb.
Yeah, so I would very much resonate with certain themes in terms of wanting human flourishing. I would want to see a kind of Christian humanism that, as my friend Andrew Fellows talks about, that sees the potential of humans as being made in the image of God. But yeah, I think we need the roots within the Christian worldview to sustain the fruits of a society that cares for the poor, for the vulnerable, for those in need. I would see that there being times of dependence as being a feature, not a bug, of human nature, because it's something that draws us closer into relationship with one another, gives us opportunity to show love and care for one another, and also points us to our need for God, in whom we find our greatest flourishing. So I would see it as, we've talked about hierarchies of value, but it's having a rightly ordered loves, as the Christian tradition would talk about it. And I think that if you go first for self-interest, that actually can undercut your flourishing. Whereas if you go for love of God first and love of others first, then you get rational self-interest thrown in as you invest in those things. That will give you your fullest, truest flourishing, both as an individual and for society.
And Thomas, what's your elevator pitch?
My vision of the future, just imagine a Star Trek future, but times 1,000. Like, interplanetary civilization, incredibly wealthy spiritually and physically, a society in which you have a medical scanner in your room that checks you for malignant tumors and any other genetic defects every morning, a society where you can catch a ride to the other side of the planet in 30 minutes from your hometown, just where you can start any business easily, quickly. You can do any line of work. You have untold material wealth, vertical farming. We climate engineer the planet so nobody ever dies in a severe storm or something like that, and we have protected green spaces and things like that. But we're doing that because we want to, because it's a value to us. We're preserving the things we value. We've turned Mars into a beautiful paradise, and probably moons of Jupiter and things like that as well. This vision of being able to step forth into the world and discover it and enjoy it and live it, and a world in which everyone who wants to and is prepared to can go forth and create value and discover the universe. Like, that's the world I want to live in.
I feel so torn because both of these visions of the future.
I can co-sign on that. Just add God to the mix.
I think these visions of the future are immensely exciting. Thomas Walker-Worth, Caleb Woodbridge, it's been so fantastic to have you on the show. It's not often that we hear Randian objectivism in conversation with Christian morality, so this has been a real privilege. Thank you for joining us.
Sure.
Thank you.